Welcome to the third part of our lecture series for the subject correctional administration. Okay, so in the previous series, okay, we started discussing on the historical account of correction. So we will continue with the discussion of some of the uh, American history in as far as American and European history in as far as correction administration is concerned. Okay, so let us proceed. So we have here a question. It is a prison that consists of a large circular building containing multi-cells around its periphery. This type of prison allows visual observation from the outside. Okay, so this particular type of concept, okay, design for that matter for a prison, was conceptualized by no less than Jeremy Bentham. The idea here is that okay, the prison guards, okay, will be staying inside as well as outside because they have a complete vision, okay, of what is happening inside the individual cells of the inmates. The idea here is that if the activities of the inmates are seen around the clock, then definitely they will be easily, or they will comply with all the prison rules and regulation. Okay, so the answer for this particular question is no less than the Panopticon prison. Okay, another question that is associated with this Panopticon prison is this. It is a prison facility which is also known as the inspection house. Again, the answer for this particular question is the Panopticon prison. In as far as this Panopticon prison is concerned, the reason why it is called as an inspection house, as we have made mention earlier, the prison guards has the ability to see the ongoing activities of the inmates while they are in their individual cells. Okay, another personality in the field of correction is we have here John Howard. So John Howard, okay, is as we have made mentioned in the earlier series, okay, he was responsible in influencing the passage of Penitentiary Act of 1779 that drastically changed the landscape of prison management in Europe, particularly in England. I have here another question. Okay, this is in America. So this prison system puts an emphasis on moral and religious dimensions. It was believed that maximizing time for repentance would contribute to the efficiency of the reform. It adopted the principle of total separation of prisoners. Now, in this particular question, what is noteworthy to consider here is the idea that the inmates are subject to what we call as religious instructions. Now, the so-called religious instructions, okay, is required for every inmate under this system, considering the fact that they are all required to read the Bible. So, anytime within the week, while it is true that this is in the form of a total separation or total isolation, however, once a week, the inmates are being visited by a chaplain or by a priest, for that matter, to look on to the progress of the readings made by that of the offender as far as the religious instructions are concerned. So the answer for this particular question is no less than we have there the Pennsylvanian prison system. Now the idea of this Pennsylvanian prison system is to prevent fraternization, or what we call as prisonization among inmates. The idea is that when the inmates are mixed together, it would be possible, okay, for these so-called inmates to contaminate the behavior of others. Because you have to remember, okay, as far as the solitary system or the so-called Pennsylvanian system is concerned, the idea is that whatever, okay, abnormal behavior the person possesses, he will keep it to himself, and that is also the basis on the part of the prison to provide some sort of treatment which revolves around the so-called moral and religious dimensions. Okay, I have here another question. It is considered as the forerunner of modern penology. Okay, so when we talk about the so-called modern penology concept, the idea of modern penology is the mixture of institutionalized and non-institutionalized treatment. Okay, so that, okay, in as far as modern penology is concerned, while it is true that you will keep a person inside the prison for purposes of serving his sentence, there is a recognition that at a certain period of time they could be reformed already. So that in order to allow them or to allow these prisoners to be released earlier than scheduled, they will be given, okay, a particular form of treatment in the form of community-based treatment, okay, wherein they will be allowed to be released earlier, subject to certain limitations or subject to certain conditions. And this idea was, although it started as early as the time of Alexander Maconochie in the Norfolk prison colony, however, it was propagated, okay, by this particular prison facility, okay, which we call today as the so-called the Elmira Reformatory. So the Elmira Reformatory basically introduced a training school type, okay, of facility, okay, wherein the education of the prisoners are given a priority, okay, and at the same time they are allowed, okay, to undergo some sort of solitary confinement, and at the same time a congregated workshop were adopted similar to what we call as the Auburn prison system. And while it is true that they are making use of that, while the prisoners are confined inside the prison, eventually, okay, the prisoners will be allowed to be used or to be released, okay, under a particular program which we come to know today as the parole system. We have to understand that when we are talking about the so-called parole, okay, the inmates, okay, are actually being given that particular opportunity to prove themselves for an early release. In short, while they are inside the prison, they are actually focusing on reforming themselves, okay, by means of proper labor, by means of showing good behavior, because these are the fundamental requirements in order for a person to be released on parole under the so-called Elmira Reformatory. Okay? And then, in like manner, nasa Amerika American history pa rin tayo. Yan. So what are the 5 major deployment schemes in America? Now, when we talk about the so-called deployment schemes, this is types of institutions, okay, on how offenders are being kept. Well, in the Philippines, okay, there are 2 major deployment schemes that we have. We have here industrial prison, which is basically a representation of the New Bilibid prison, and we have the other facilities under the Bucor, which are referred to as, okay, the so-called agricultural plantations or agricultural prison, because they are focused on agricultural work. Okay. Now in the United States, okay, they have basically 5 types of prison movement. Okay, so we have here the Northern Industrial Prison. Okay, aside from the Northern Industrial Prison, we also have the Southern Agricultural Plantation, the chain gangs, the custody-oriented prison system, and we have there the treatment-oriented prison. Okay. Now, when we are talking about the so-called industrial prison, the prisoners, okay, are actually being made to perform labor, okay, for the upkeep of the facility, and at the same time providing profit for the state. Okay, during this period, immediately after the American Civil War, okay, the American economy has been completely devastated. Okay, and so that, okay, other departments, particularly the prison, okay, of the United States, need to look for some source of funding. And one way of funding the operation of their prison is by means of engaging the inmates into what we call as worthwhile occupation, okay, as a means of supporting the operation of the prison. Now, under the Northern Industrial Prison, there were three methods that were adopted. The first one here is that we have there the so-called the contract system. Now, under the contract system, prisoners were hired, okay, by businessmen or corporation for a set of fee per day. So that under this so-called contract system, the inmates are being transferred from the prison going to the industrial complex. And when they are there at the industrial complex, then they will be required to perform labor depending on the line of business of the businessman hiring them. At the end of each month, okay, the businessman will have to pay the prison instead of paying the inmates. They will instead pay the prison, okay, who sent these inmates, and the prison will make use of this money for purposes of maintaining the prison, and at the same time, this is also where they draw the salary of the prison guards. Now, another method that was used, okay, in the industrial prison is that we have there the so-called state account system. Under the state account system, this is a variation from the contract system because they have seen that there is a danger, okay, in as far as transporting the inmates to and from the prison facility. So instead of transferring the prisoners to the businesses, it is now the businesses who will come to the prison. So under the state account system, the contractors or the prisoners for that matter will provide the raw materials, okay, will provide the machineries, the equipments, and the prison will provide the manpower or will provide the labor. So in short, okay, instead of leaving the premises of the prison, they will have to wait inside the prison, and at the same time, the raw materials will be coming in, and expectedly at the end of a particular period of time, the businessman will take the product and it will pay the prison according to the number of products produced. And then we also have there the state use system. Under the state use system, okay, the prison already removed the involvement of the businessman. So this is under the state use system. The prison operates its own business. Okay, so okay, they made use of or they supply the prison with the raw materials. The prisoners will produce the product, and then the prison will also sell the product. Now, the problem comes now when the American prison adopted the state use system, because this is where corruption started to flourish inside the prison. So the prison authorities, the prison superintendent, prison officials for that matter, are actually taking the product for themselves. Okay, so without paying the government, and at the same time, okay, they under-declare the products that were produced by the so-called prison. So eventually, okay, the American government, okay, saw the need, okay, to prohibit the use of the so-called prison-made products, okay, and they prohibited it from being sold to the public, okay, to curb down the corruption within the prison. So that eventually, okay, several laws were passed in US to prohibit the sale of prison-made products to the public, which was eventually referred to as the enabling acts. Enabling acts meaning, okay, that of course it empowered, okay, that of the American states, okay, to stop, okay, and at the same time to prevent the sale of the so-called prison-made, okay, products. Now, another deployment scheme in the United States, okay, aside from industrial prison, is that we also have the Southern Agricultural Plantation. Since the southern part of America has been completely devastated as a result of the Civil War, okay, so they are looking at how they would be able to improve that the southern part of the United States. So what they did instead, what the government did instead is to, of course, convert the vast majority of the lands as an agricultural plantation, and the manpower is being supplied by that of the prison. However, some of the problems that were noted under the so-called agricultural plantation is the lack of prison guards to man these agricultural plantations. So in turn, they turned to that of the inmates and converted some of the inmates as what we call as now as the prison trustees, and they expected them to perform the same function as that of the prison guards. Okay, but then again, this is also where abuses came in, because some inmates, okay, who were converted as inmates trustees started to abuse the power given to them. And then, of course, we also have there the so-called the chain gangs. So the chain gangs, the term chain, okay, in the Tagalog vernacular, yan yung kadena. Okay, so meaning that the prisoners, a group of 5 prisoners are being chained with one another, and then they are being deployed on the streets to perform public works, such as, for example, the construction of roads, construction of bridges, as well as the maintenance of these roads and bridges. Okay, so initially the chain gangs was initially intended for the blacks, but then eventually, because of anti-discrimination in the United States, the eventually included whites, until such time that women were also included as part of this so-called chain gangs program. And then we also have there the so-called the custody-oriented prison. Now, in the event that, of course, there are always a group of prisoners who remain to be uh, incorrigible. Okay, so in the case of incorrigibles, hardcore criminals for that matter, the deployment scheme that was devised for this particular group of prisoners is in the form of a custody-oriented prison. So unlike here in the Philippines, in the United States, they usually construct a particular prison which is primarily intended for maximum security offenders only. So that is why we often hear, or we often see in movies, okay, talking that they are talking about maximum security facility or maximum security prison, because it is intended really for a single group of offender, and that is a maximum security prisoners. Okay, so that is for the custody oriented. And then, of course, for those who have committed, okay, a very simple instruction, something in infractions, something like that. Okay, and at the same time, this group of offenders is seen to be easily reformed or rehabilitated. So we have here the so-called treatment-oriented prison. So under this treatment-oriented prison, it involves a whole area of prison rehabilitation program that includes, among others, anger management, that includes therapeutic community, and so on and so forth, with the end in view, okay, of eventually maximizing the rehabilitation process involving the so-called inmates. Okay, so the effect of centralization of power resulting to construction of other state prisons. And of course, prisoners were eventually allowed to work were allowed on what we call as work release or furlough. Under the so-called work release or furlough, the inmates, okay, could be made, okay, to choose on how they would be able to serve their sentence. It could either be that if they are given a particular period of 6 months of imprisonment, they could actually choose to serve it, okay, 1 week at a time. Meaning 1 week in prison and then 1 week outside, and then go back to prison to serve another 1 week, and then go, and then so on and so forth. Now there are also, okay, other forms, okay, which is referred to as the work release, wherein in order not to disrupt the income of that particular offender, okay, then that offender will be allowed to be released during daytime to go to work, perform his daily task, and then at nighttime he will go back to prison to serve his prison sentence. So that is what we call as the so-called the work release program. Okay. There are also 3 revolutions in the history of American corrections. So again, we are talking here of the American corrections. So we have here the so-called age of reformation. As we have made mention in the previous series lecture, okay, the age of reformation is very parallel to that of the age of enlightenment. However, okay, the difference between the two is the place of its occurrence. Age of enlightenment transpired in Europe, and age of reformation transpired in the United States. So what was the subject of the so-called Age of Reformation, or what will characterize this Age of Reformation? The Age of Reformation basically is being characterized by the idea, okay, that the method of dealing with criminals, instead of death penalty and torture, it was eventually replaced, okay, into a system of punishment which we come to know today as imprisonment. So the Age of Reformation is basically characterized by the use of prison as a means of dealing with criminals. And then we also have there the Age of Rehabilitation. Okay. Now, while it is true that America started to make use of prison, okay, it did not turn out well, considering the fact that they have seen, okay, a lot of offenders who are actually recidivating, meaning that they are committing another crime and going back to prison again. So the Americans, okay, American prison thought of uh, what should be done in order to reduce the incidence of recidivism among the inmates or among the prisoners. So they thought of giving rehabilitation program. And when they started uh, giving rehabilitation program to the inmates, that now what characterizes yung tinatawag natin na the age of rehabilitation. So bakit tinawag na age of rehabilitation? Because the prison started to adapt rehabilitation program with the end in view of correcting the abnormal behavior of prisoners confined in that prison. And then, of course, we also have the so-called the age of reintegration. Now, the so-called age of reintegration, okay, considering the fact that they have seen that while it is true, okay, that prisoners are being given rehabilitation program, but the same problem occurs. There is still a higher degree of recidivism among the inmates who are released from confinement. And then eventually, okay, they suspended the use of rehabilitation programs, and then they brought it back again because they already have identified the problem. It is not the prison who failed to rehabilitate the criminal offender, but it was the community who failed to accept the offenders who are being released from confinement. Okay, the idea basically is that, of course, humans will always be humans. Okay, they will never learn to forgive. Okay, and at the same time, there is also the possibility that they will keep on sticking to the label that was initially given to that of the offender. So if they know for sure that the offender or that the person came from prison, then perhaps the opportunity is lesser for this particular group of individual. So in the age of reintegration, America entered into that particular period wherein they started to empower the community so that the community will somehow realize the importance of, okay, providing assistance, okay, not only to the prison but to the prisoners as well, okay, by offering them equal job opportunity, okay, as that of a free man. Okay, and then there are also several programs, okay, in the United States that was uh, a product of innovation, okay, for purposes of somehow trying to alleviate, okay, the living conditions of the so-called offenders. Okay, so there were innovations, okay, and one of the innovations are of course the numerous studies conducted in Chicago, which was referred eventually as the Chicago Area Project. Okay, so the Chicago Area Project was basically founded by no less than Clifford Shaw. So it is a delinquency prevention program. Okay, it is the first organized program in the United States to use workers to establish direct and personal contacts with the unreached boys to help them find their way back to acceptable norm of conduct. So the idea here is that by reforming these juvenile delinquents, they are actually trying to prevent the entry, okay, of offenders into the, okay, prison. So that, okay, this so-called group of people or this works, okay, and the people involved are basically considered as the gatekeepers. So gatekeepers in the sense that they are preventing the entry of prisoners into the prison by means of addressing now the problems, okay, facing the society, most especially in the case of these juvenile delinquents. And then a study was conducted, okay, and it is actually the Cambridge Somerville study. So the idea of Cambridge Somerville study is to test the effectivity or the effectiveness of individual counseling with, okay, delinquent boys with a higher tendency of becoming a criminal. So they wanted to know whether or not what you call this counseling has an impact, okay, in changing the behavior of the delinquent boys with high probability of becoming a criminal. So the approach, okay, was friendly rather than being professional, okay, which involved the actual approach of watching two groups. Take note, two groups of delinquent boys. One group of the delinquent boys, okay, was left alone. No intervention was made. And the other group, okay, was given the so-called rehabilitation program. Because as we have been mentioned, the idea here is to test whether, okay, this counseling really has something to do with, okay, changing the behavior of the delinquent boys. However, the result of this study did not materialize because, okay, of World War II. Okay, World War II broke out. So, okay, some of the delinquent boys actually that we are talking here were actually sent to fight in the army or in the navy or in the marines, something like that. And then we also have the Shalom House. So the Shalom House is a communal, okay, voluntary settling, okay, for drug addicts. So kagaya ngayon, let's say for example, okay, nagpatukang or they voluntarily surrendered, okay, drug surrendering for that matter, then definitely, okay, parang ganun yung mangyayari that they will be referred into the rehabilitation center. Provided, however, that their stay in the rehabilitation center is voluntary on their part in order for them to eventually change their behavior, okay, or to treat their addiction, something like that. And the moment that these offenders or that these drug addicts, for that matter, are already reformed, or if they are treated, it is expected that they will have to stay in the Shalom House to help, okay, other drug addicts coming in, okay, to the facility and help them also to be reformed or rehabilitated. It is just like saying that, of course, those who have experience being a drug user, being a drug dependent, will be the best person who could also help existing or current drug dependents to reform. And then, of course, we also have the PORT program. So basically, the PORT program is uh, tawag natin din to, intended for probationers. So in order to maximize the community rehabilitation program of these so-called inmates, it is but important that they will stay in one particular facility, or they will stay in one particular community for purposes of their treatment and rehabilitation. So that is the PORT program. A single community, a single village for that matter, and these probationers will choose to stay in this particular area in order for them to maximize their reformation as well as their rehabilitation. Okay, and then of course, we have there the justifications of punishment. So justification of punishment, okay, if a state for that matter will have to impose a particular punishment to a person who have wronged the community, then these are the justification that exist. Okay, so first one is that we have their retribution. So retribution, okay, it is the process whereby the punishment is provided, take note, by the state whose sanction is violated, to afford the society or the individual, okay, the opportunity of imposing upon the offender suitable punishment as might be enforced. Okay, so the idea of retribution is that offenders should be punished because they deserve it. Okay, so if we are going to consider looking at the meaning of the word retribution, retribution would mean that it is, okay, in a form of revenge, vengeance, something like that. But to answer the question, is retribution similar with retaliation? Okay, so the answer to that question is, of course, no. Okay, while it is true that in books, okay, you could see, okay, the term retribution being attributed to what we call as retaliation. If you are going to look at the meaning of retribution and retaliation, they are very much synonymous. However, the problem with that is they are different in as far as who implements, okay, the act of vengeance, okay, or the act of let's say revenge. Okay, in retribution, it is done in a social, okay, form, meaning, okay, if I was a victim of a particular person, okay, then I will have to go to the police, report it to the police to allow the process of retribution to take place. So the police will arrest him, they will investigate, charges will be filed in court, the court will convict him, and the court will, okay, put him in prison. And that is basically a form of state sanctioned punishment, something like that. But when we talk about retaliation, somebody, okay, injured me, then I will have to injure him myself. Diba? So that is basically retaliation. It is taken on a personal level and not on the social level. And then we also have there the so-called expiation or atonement. Okay, so when we speak of expiation or atonement, this is a concept, okay, whereby the purpose of the state of giving punishment is simply to satisfy that of the offended public or group. The question is, why do we need to satisfy the offended public or group? We need to satisfy the offended public or group to prevent them from engaging in, okay, what we call as retaliation. We do not want them to retaliate, okay, personally to the offender, because that will bring about another crime, which will become a problem of the society as well. And we do not want that to happen. Okay? And then, of course, we have there the obvious reason why we provide the punishment, and that is basically deterrence. So basically, when we talk about deterrence, we are talking about the terrorizing effect of punishment. Diba? So when somebody is punished, you do not want to do the same mistake committed by that person, because you do not want the punishment that was given to him. Okay? And the punishment works both ways. It provides fear, okay, of committing crime on the part of the offender, and it provides fear of committing crime on the part of the people who witnessed how the punishment was imposed, something like that. And then, of course, we also have the incapacitation and protection. So incapacitation, who will be incapacitated? It is the criminal offender. Who will be protected by the incapacitation of the offender? It is the community. So incapacitation in the sense that we are removing one element of crime. And the element of crime we are removing is basically the opportunity, okay, to commit the crime. Okay, so in as far as incapacitation is concerned, the basic approach that the government is doing about that is basically by means of putting them inside the prison. So by putting them inside the prison, will that prevent them from committing crime? The answer basically to that question is yes. And then, of course, we also have the reformation or rehabilitation. So reformation or rehabilitation stems from two basic ideas. Okay, so the first idea here is of European origin. We have there the positivist theory by the group of Italians, okay, Cesar Lombroso, Enrico Ferri, and Rafael Garofalo, who believes that a particular person, an offender for that matter, should not be punished, okay, but rather they have to be reformed or rehabilitated. Okay, so it should not be punishment, but rather it should be, okay, reformation. It should be in a form of treatment, because these offenders are considered as sick individuals. Okay, so another concept that spurs the idea of reformation or rehabilitation is the medical model. So medical model of dealing with criminal offenders is an American concept, which revolves around the idea of positivism, just the same. In the medical model, again, they look at criminals as if they are sick people. That instead of you giving them punishment, why not give them a certain degree of rehabilitation? Okay? So reformation and rehabilitation. Okay? So that ends our third part. Please wait for the fourth part, okay, of our lecture series. Thank you very much for listening.